Okay, so, we love getting those deep dive suggestions from you, and this one really hit a nerve.
Yeah,
It's a big one, for sure.
it is a big one.
We're tackling The Road to Serfdom
Yeah.
by Hayek, or at least excerpts from it. That's what you sent us.
Right. Excerpts.
It's a book that's been, sparking debate for I don't know how long.
Decades.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, at least since World War II.
And for good reason. I
Mm.
mean, this is about some really fundamental stuff,
Yeah.
about how society should be organized, how the economy should work.
About the role of individual liberty.
Exactly. And it's all tied together.
And the role of government.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Friedrich von Hayek, just a quick intro, he was this giant in economics.
Mm.
And he wrote this book during a really pivotal moment, like World War II was raging.
Right in the thick of it.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because while the world was, focused on this immediate conflict, Hayek's already thinking about what comes after.
Thinking ahead.
Yeah, what's the world going to look like after this is all over?
And worried, yeah.
And specifically, he's worried about some of the talk about economic planning for the post-war world, particularly in those Allied countries.
Mm.
And he's coming from Austria.
Yeah, he had fled Austria
Right to go.
with the rise of the Nazis.
Yeah, he sees firsthand what totalitarianism can look like. So
He's got that experience. Yeah.
he's got that in his mind.
Yeah.
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 So this wasn't just him analyzing what was happening at that moment.
Yeah.
It was a warning.
A warning.
It was a warning bell
Yeah.
about what could happen if we're not careful.
Right.
And that's why we're doing this deep dive, right? To
Sure.
really understand what he was trying to say.
Yeah.
Get to those core arguments about the relationship between government economic planning and individual liberty.
Mhm.
And, it's amazing how relevant this still feels.
Yeah. I mean, it keeps coming back
Yeah, these aren't just old ideas. They keep popping up in new ways.
in new ways.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why this book has had such staying power,
Absolutely. And why we're still talking about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to really appreciate Hayek's perspective, we have to start with, like, where he was coming from during the war itself.
Right.
What was he seeing? What was he doing?
Yeah.
So even before he wrote The Road to Serfdom, Hayek's actively trying to contribute to the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
He actually reaches out to the British Ministry of Information.
Wow.
Yeah, with like all these proposals for propaganda campaigns
Sure.
aimed at German-speaking populations.
Interesting. It's
Yeah.
using his skills.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is it shows how deeply he believed in those principles of liberty,
Yeah.
that he saw Britain and France fighting for.
He's putting his money where his mouth is.
Yeah, exactly. He's
Yeah.
not just, sitting back and theorizing, he's like actively engaged.
Right.
But then his experiences during the war, they really shaped those anxieties that he later expresses in The Road to Serfdom.
Yeah.
He sees how total war just demands this complete reshaping of the economy.
Yeah.
Right? You've got to produce weapons, you've got to get troops supplied.
Everything has to be redirected.
Yeah, and so you see this massive reallocation of resources
Right.
to war production.
Uh-huh.
And then to manage all this, you have price controls, rationing,
Yeah.
all this stuff, which essentially means you're moving away from a free market and
It's
towards,
central control.
yeah, you have to have that central control.
You have to fight a war.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
but here's his big concern. As the Allies start winning,
Oh, here we go.
the socialists in Britain especially, they start looking at these wartime controls and they're thinking,
Mm.
like, maybe this could work for us.
Yeah. As a model for the post-war world.
Right.
And he specifically calls out the British Labour Party and their 1942 pamphlet, The Old World and the New Society.
Okay.
Have you seen this one?
I have. Yeah, it's a fascinating read in hindsight.
Yeah, it really lays out their vision.
Yeah.
And they explicitly call for a planned society.
To replace the old competitive system. And they're like, we need to keep these wartime controls in place for industries, for agriculture.
To make sure everybody's taken care of.
Yeah. To avoid what they call a scramble,
Right back to the chaos
Right.
of the free market.
Yeah. And this is what really solidifies Hayek's fears, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's seeing it play out right in front of him. It's
Yeah.
like a confirmation of his fears.
Yeah. And the key takeaway here is even in times of crisis, right?
Yeah.
When you need that collective action,
Mm-hmm.
the mechanisms you put in place, they can pose this long-term threat
A long-term threat.
to individual liberty.
If you don't dismantle them.
If you don't dismantle them after the crisis has passed,
Right.
and it's this classic worry, right,
Oh, yeah.
about power.
The nature of power.
Once the state gathers all this power during an emergency,
It's hard to give it up.
It's hard to give it up.
Right.
Politicians, bureaucracies, they develop this taste for control.
They get used to it.
Right. And so Hayek's warning is like, be watchful, be wary.
Be skeptical.
Yeah. Especially when you're constantly being told about these ongoing crises that just require more and more centralized power.
More and more control.
Yeah. And this leads us to another interesting aspect of why he even wrote this book.
Okay.
He was concerned about the intellectual climate at the time.
Yeah.
He felt like the people who should have been guiding public opinion on these crucial issues,
The experts.
The experts.
Yeah, the economists.
The economists, they were mostly tied up in the war effort.
Right, doing other things.
Doing other things right. They're working for the government.
Yeah.
The voices are kind of constrained by their positions.
They're not free to speak out.
Right.
In the same way.
And so what happens?
The public discourse is left to...
The amateurs.
Yeah, he calls them amateurs and cranks.
Yeah, the people with their own agendas and their own...
Pet solutions.
Yeah, they're pet solutions and not necessarily a deep understanding of economics.
Right, they're well-meaning, but maybe not fully informed.
Right. And so Hayek, he feels this sense of duty.
Yeah.
Like he has to step into that gap.
Fill the void.
Yeah.
Provide that expert voice.
Even though he doesn't feel, totally qualified in that traditional sense.
Right. He's not in an official position.
Right. He's not a government economist or anything.
Yeah, but he feels he has to speak out.
He has to speak out.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that, he himself acknowledged later on that his central argument in The Road to Serfdom wasn't entirely original.
Right. Others had made similar points.
Others had touched on these ideas before. But what he felt he was doing was providing this really detailed explanation.
Spelling it out.
Yeah, spelling it out.
In a really clear way.
Of why economic planning would likely lead to these unintended consequences.
And how
that process would unfold step by step.
Yeah, that step-by-step breakdown is really crucial.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so powerful, I think.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's get into some of those arguments.
Yeah.
Let's dig into the core of what he's trying to say.
Okay.
And one of the first things he does is he talks about how we even define and understand socialism.
Yeah.
It's a big one.
It is, because it's such a loaded term.
Right. And he points out that it's often used in these two very different ways.
Two different ways.
So on the one hand, you have this set of ideals.
Yeah.
Things like social justice, equality, security, making sure everyone's taken care of.
The good stuff.
Right, the good stuff.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have this very specific method.
For achieving those things.
Yeah, for trying to achieve those ideals.
Right.
And that method is basically the abolition of private enterprise.
Get rid of the free market.
Yeah. And the creation of a centrally planned economy.
Top-down control.
Yeah.
Right.
And Hayek, he actually prefers to use the term collectivism.
To describe that method.
Yeah, for that method.
The central planning.
Right. And he sees socialism as just one particular type of collectivism.
Right. One way of doing it.
Yeah, and he felt that by focusing on those collectivist methods,
yeah,
you could have a much clearer discussion.
Yeah, less emotional, less ideological.
Yeah, because he argues that the fundamental disagreement
between socialists and liberals,
right, are not necessarily about those ultimate goals.
Yeah, everyone wants a better society.
Right, everyone wants people to be taken care of.
Yeah.
But it's about the means.
The how.
How
did you get there?
Yeah, how do you get there?
Right.
And he also talks about, why the idea of planning itself became so popular.
Yeah, everyone loves a good plan.
Right. It just sounds good.
It sounds rational. It sounds sensible.
It does.
Especially after the chaos of war.
Yeah, you're like, let's plan this out. Let's have a rational approach.
Let's avoid the mistakes of the past.
Right. But Hayek's concern
is with central planning.
Yeah, that's the key distinction.
Not just planning in general, but central. Like one plan to rule them all.
Yeah, one single overarching plan.
Yeah, one body deciding everything for everyone.
And he contrasts that with what he calls the liberal approach.
Right.
Which is about creating a framework.
A framework of rules.
Yeah, a stable, predictable framework of rules.
Within which individuals can make their own plans.
Right. So it's not about no planning. It's about
the right kind of planning.
Right. It's about planning the framework.
Yeah, and then letting individuals make their own choices within that framework.
Right. And this leads us to his discussion of competition.
Yeah.
And this is important because, sometimes people paint Hayek as this like
pre-market absolutist.
Yeah, like laissez-faire, let the market do whatever it wants.
And that's not quite right.
He's not saying that at all.
No.
He actually sees competition
As a vital principle.
as a vital principle.
Yeah, but one that requires government.
But one that requires government action.
Yeah, active government.
To set it up.
To make sure it works properly.
Yeah, to make sure it works properly.
Yeah.
You need laws against coercion and fraud.
Right, you can't have people cheating.
Right, you can't have people, strong-arming each other.
Right.
You need guarantees of freedom to trade.
Right.
You need rules to make sure that new businesses can enter the market.
Yeah, level playing field.
Yeah, so he's not saying government does nothing.
No.
He's saying government has a very specific role.
Yeah, to create and maintain that framework.
To create and maintain that framework within which competition can flourish.
Right.
But he was definitely not a fan.
Of price controls.
Yeah, of the government trying to control prices or the quantities of goods being produced.
Right.
He saw that as really undermining the whole point of competition.
Yeah, because prices act as signals.
Signals.
Yeah, in a free market.
They tell producers and consumers what's going on.
They tell producers how much to produce.
Right.
And they tell consumers how much to buy.
Right. So if the price goes up, it means
Demand is high.
Demand is high.
Supply is low.
And vice versa.
Like vice versa.
Right. So if the government comes in and messes with those prices,
They're distorting the signals.
they're distorting the signals.
Yeah.
And then the market can't function properly.
Right. It can't adjust.
Now he did acknowledge that there are certain areas where government intervention might be justified,
Right.
where competition doesn't really work.
Like where it breaks down.
Yeah, like public goods.
Yeah.
Or externalities.
All right. Where one person's actions affect others.
Right. Classic example.
The lighthouse.
The lighthouse, right?
Everyone benefits from it.
Everyone benefits.
But no one wants to pay for it.
So the market might not provide enough lighthouses.
Right.
Or clean air.
Right.
Or things like that.
Yeah, those are classic examples.
But he argued that these exceptions,
don't invalidate the rule.
they don't justify getting rid of competition altogether.
Right. It's not a carte blanche to control everything.
Right. It's about being very specific about
Where it's needed.
where it's needed.
Yeah.
And another big argument that the planning folks made was that it was inevitable.
Oh, yeah, the inevitability argument.
Yeah, driven by technology,
And complexity.
by the increasing complexity of modern economy.
Now the world's just too complicated now.
Right. We need someone in charge.
Someone to steer the ship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Hayek really pushes back against this idea of the inevitability of planning.
Yeah. He sees it as a choice,
Yeah.
not a destiny.
Not a destiny.
Yeah.
He says, the trend towards monopolies and government planning, it's not some unavoidable outcome.
Of objective facts.
Right. It's a result of ideas.
And opinions.
Of ideas and opinions that have been gaining ground.
And being promoted.
Yeah. And he points out that a lot of the people who are pushing for planning, they're these, what he calls single-minded idealists.
Right.
They're focused on achieving these specific goals.
Like tunnel vision.
Yeah.
They have the best of intentions.
They have the best of intentions, but they don't necessarily see
the big picture.
Yeah, the big picture, how all the different parts of a complex society fit together.
Right. And how their actions might have unintended consequences.
And this links to one of Hayek's central concerns.
Yeah.
The rule of law.
Oh, yeah, a big one.
So for Hayek, the rule of law, this is what distinguishes a free society.
From an arbitrary one.
Yeah, from a society where the government can just do whatever it wants.
Right.
It's about the government being bound.
By rules.
By clear, established rules.
That are known in advance.
Right, that are public. Everyone knows what the rules are.
So you can plan your life accordingly.
Right. You know what to expect.
Yeah.
But collectivist economic planning, he argues.
That clashes with the rule of law.
It clashes with that fundamentally.
Because you can't plan everything in advance.
Right.
You have to make decisions on the fly.
And those decisions, they can't just be derived from some,
pre-existing set of rules.
Pre-existing set of rules.
Yeah.
So instead of the law being applied impartially to everyone, you end up with these subjective judgments.
Being made by those in power.
Yeah. And that can lead to all sorts of problems.
New forms of inequality.
Yeah, new forms of inequality, privilege.
Yeah.
And he makes this really interesting point about formal equality versus substantive equality.
Hey, explain that one.
Yeah, so formal equality is the idea that everyone is subject to the same rules.
Right. Everyone's treated the same by the law.
Right. But substantive equality is the idea that everyone should have roughly the same
incomes.
Yeah, the same level of wealth or resources.
Yeah.
And he argues that those two things are actually incompatible.
How so?
Because if you want to achieve the same outcomes for different people,
you have to treat them differently.
You have to treat them differently.
Right.
And he points out that both socialists and Nazis, they were critical of this idea of
Merely formal justice.
Yeah, because they wanted the law to be used.
To achieve those substantive goals.
So achieve those substantive goals of economic and social equality.
Right.
So like, everyone having the right to start a business, that's formal equality.
Yeah.
But if some people have way more resources to actually do it,
then that's where you need intervention.
then that's where the push for substantive equality comes in.
Right.
But the problem is,
who decides how to intervene?
Yeah, who decides and how do they decide?
And what are the unintended consequences?
Right. And,
Yeah.
and Hayek's point is that you can't just assume that the people in power are going to make those decisions.
Wisely and fairly.
Right.
Yeah.
And he emphasizes, the liberal system. It's not about the government doing nothing.
No.
It's not about that laissez-faire idea.
It's about predictable action.
Yeah. It's about the government acting in a predictable way.
Within those established rules.
Within those established rules so that individuals have the freedom and the security to make their own plans.
Without constantly worrying about the government changing the rules on them.
Exactly.
Yeah, that predictability is key.
And that brings us to another interesting point he makes about what he calls the illusion of purely economic ends.
Okay.
This is a bit of a head scratcher.
It is, but it's really important.
It's important.
Yeah.
So he's challenging this idea that you can just separate out economic goals
from all the other stuff.
From all the other things we value in
Right.
life.
Yeah.
So for example, he says money.
Right.
Money is not usually an end in itself.
Unless you're Scrooge McDuck.
Right.
Swimming in your vault of gold coins.
Right. It's a means to an end.
Yeah.
It's a way to achieve all sorts of different goals.
Which might be unpredictable.
Which might be totally unpredictable.
Yeah.
Right. And he sees money as this crucial tool of freedom.
Yeah, because it gives you choices.
Because it gives you choices.
It expands your options.
Yeah, even if you don't have that much money.
Yeah, you still have more choices than if you had no money.
Right. It gives you some agency.
Yeah.
But when socialists talk about replacing that pecuniary motive.
The drive to earn money.
Right. With these non-economic incentives.
Like public recognition.
Like honors or privileges.
Yeah.
What's the problem with that from Hayek's perspective?
The problem is who controls those rewards.
Yeah.
Because whoever controls them.
They have a lot of power.
They have a huge amount of power.
Right. They not only decide the size of the reward.
They decide the form it takes.
Yeah.
So you lose that individual choice.
Yeah.
You're no longer free to pursue what you value.
Right. And ultimately, if the state controls your economic pursuits,
they control everything.
They end up controlling everything.
Right. Your economic freedom is tied to all your other freedom.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It is.
And this leads us to his discussion of freedom and equality.
Yeah, another big one.
Another big one.
Right.
And he makes this distinction between what he calls the new freedom.
The new freedom.
And the old freedom.
The old freedom.
So the new freedom is the freedom from necessity.
Freedom from want.
Yeah.
Freedom from economic hardship.
Right. The idea that everyone should have enough to live a decent life.
Right.
And the old freedom is the freedom from coercion.
Freedom from being forced to do things.
Yeah, freedom from being forced by other people or by the state.
Right.
And Hayek's point is that the pursuit of that new freedom.
Of trying to achieve that perfect economic equality.
Right, through central planning.
Yeah.
It carries a huge risk.
It does.
Because in order to do that, you have to have these central authorities.
Making decisions about who gets what.
Right, making decisions about who deserves what, who needs what.
Yeah.
And there's no objective standard for those decisions.
It becomes arbitrary.
It becomes totally arbitrary.
Yeah.
And then you end up with these potentially really unfair outcomes.
And resentment from people who feel like they've been treated unfairly.
And he also points to this kind of unsettling historical overlap.
Oh, yeah?
In the methods used by socialist and totalitarian regimes.
This is a bit provocative.
It is, but it's something we have to consider.
Yeah.
He notes that a lot of those techniques of social control
that we associate with fascism.
Yeah.
Things like youth organizations.
Yeah.
State-controlled leisure activities. Even like specific forms of greeting.
Right.
They weren't actually invented by fascists.
They weren't.
They were often pioneered by socialist movements.
Really?
Yeah, in different countries.
That's fascinating.
And his point is that these totalitarian movements...
They often capitalize on the disillusionment.
Yeah.
That happens when the grand promises of equality...
They don't materialize.
Yeah, when people get frustrated.
When the revolution doesn't deliver.
Right, and they're looking for someone to blame.
They're looking for a scapegoat.
Yeah, and that's when these totalitarian movements can really take hold.
Yeah.
And this leads into his discussion about monopolies.
Yeah.
Which is another area where he kind of goes against the grain.
Yeah.
A lot of the prey planning folks, they saw state control as the obvious solution to monopolies.
Right.
Monopolies are bad. They're inevitable in modern industry.
So the state should just take them over.
Yeah, nationalize them.
But Hayek had some serious doubts about this.
He wasn't so sure.
Yeah, he acknowledged that in some sectors, monopolies might be unavoidable.
Right.
Like utilities or natural resources.
But there's only one source.
Right.
Or it's just too expensive to have competition.
Yeah.
But he questioned whether state control was always the best answer.
Yeah.
He even suggested that having separate private monopolies,
Really?
yeah, might actually be better in some ways.
Than a single centralized state monopoly.
Yeah, because at least with private
You
monopolies,
still have some choice?
consumers have some choice.
Yeah.
They can choose between different providers.
Yeah.
Even if those providers are still monopolies,
Right.
it's still better than having no choice at all.
And his argument is that a state monopoly
It's shielded from competition.
is shielded from competition
And from criticism.
and from criticism.
Yeah.
So it can become really inefficient,
And unaccountable.
unaccountable, and potentially corrupt.
And he also points out this interesting dynamic that can happen.
Between organized labor and organized capital,
Yeah.
they can team up.
They can team up to create monopolies.
Yeah, at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah. So you get these powerful unions.
And powerful corporations.
Right. And they work together.
To restrict competition.
Yeah, to shut out new businesses.
And to drive up prices.
Yeah. And who suffers?
Consumers.
Consumers. The people who aren't part of those powerful groups.
Yeah, the little guy.
The little guy.
Right.
And then Hayek raises these really interesting questions about
Individual behavior.
Yeah, about how collectivism might affect how we act.
And our sense of responsibility.
Yeah, he's worried that when the state is expected to provide for everyone,
Yeah.
it kind of diminishes our sense of personal responsibility.
Like, why bother?
Yeah, why bother if the government's going to take care of it anyway?
Right.
And he suggests that our willingness to take initiative, to be proactive,
It can atrophy.
it can atrophy if we're constantly looking to the state to step in, and even our awareness of the need to make informed choices.
Like we become passive.
Yeah, we become passive.
We just wait for the government to tell us what to do.
Yeah, and he even raises this possibility, which is a bit uncomfortable,
Okay.
that the passion for collective action,
Yeah.
it can sometimes be a way for individuals
To indulge in selfish desire.
to indulge in selfish desires,
Yeah.
but on a collective level.
It's like a way to rationalize selfishness.
Yeah, like if I do it individually, it's bad.
But if we all do it together.
But if we all do it together, it's for the common good.
Right.
It's for the collective.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous, slippery slope.
It is a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he doesn't shy away from looking at the international implications of all this.
Right.
He argues that when individual nations pursue these large-scale economic planning schemes,
It can lead to conflict.
yeah, it can lead to international friction, trade wars.
Yeah, because everyone's trying to protect their own interests.
Right? Everyone's trying to game the system.
Yeah.
And he points out that there's this lack of a shared moral framework.
For international economic planning,
Yeah.
like within a nation.
People are more willing to share
Yeah, people are more willing to make sacrifices.
for their fellow citizens.
Right.
But on a global scale,
It's much harder.
it's much harder to get that kind of consensus
Yeah.
to agree on who gets what
Right.
and how it should be distributed.
Yeah, different cultures, different values.
Yeah, it's just a recipe for conflict.
It is, yeah.
And this brings us back to this central theme in Hayek's work.
The importance of limiting power.
Yeah, he's really hammering on this throughout the book.
Yeah.
He says we have to be willing to put limits on power.
Even when it's for a good cause.
Even when it's for a good cause.
Yeah.
Because power corrupts.
Ah, correct.
And it can lead to these unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And he saw the period after World War II as this crucial moment.
Yeah. A chance to set things right.
Yeah, a chance for the powerful nations to get together and establish this framework of international rules.
Yeah. A rule of law for the world.
Yeah, that they themselves would be bound by.
Right. Not just imposing it on others.
Right.
But following it themselves.
Leading by example.
Yeah.
And he envisioned this international rule of law.
Protecting individuals.
Yeah, protecting individuals from tyranny.
Both within their own states.
Yeah, within their own states and from international bodies.
Right.
So it's like this double layer of protection.
Yeah. Checks and balances on a global scale.
Yeah. And his ultimate goal was this global community of free individuals living under the rule of law.
A beautiful vision.
Yeah, a really beautiful vision.
Yeah.
So as Hayek looked ahead, what were those key lessons he wanted people to take away?
I think the first one was the importance of learning from the past,
Yeah.
acknowledging the mistakes that had been made and
Right.
not repeating them.
And not repeating them.
Yeah.
He also felt that the focus should be on removing obstacles.
To individual creativity
Yeah.
and enterprise,
Yeah.
not creating more centralized planning.
Right.
Get out of the way.
Yeah, get out of the way. Let people do their thing.
Yeah.
But within that framework of rules.
Right.
And it's so interesting to read Milton Friedman's introduction to the 1994 edition of